Good morning and welcome to the webinar, Expecting the Unexpected, How to be Ready for Rapidly Changing Security Challenges, brought to you by EdQuarter. My name's Anna Britton and I'm Managing Editor of EdQuarter. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll be looking at the new and future risks facing education institutions in the post-COVID-19 landscape. You will all be familiar with the cybersecurity breaches in universities that have hit the headlines during the pandemic. Between January and September this year, the Open University received well over 1 million malicious email attacks, spam, malware, and phishing attacks. And in May, 8 UK universities suffered a ransomware attack on their personal data. The stolen data included that of staff, students, and financial supporters, including alumni. So who are our cyber adversaries? And why are they increasingly turning their attention to the education sector? And what opportunities have been handed to them as a result of the disruption brought about by working from home and the remote learning model? We're going to look in detail at what's needed to keep students, staff, data and networks secure in a continually evolving cyber threat landscape. You, the audience, can ask us questions in the chat box throughout the webinar, and later we'll open the floor to a Q&A with our expert panel. With us today are 3 cybersecurity experts. I'll introduce them all in turn, and they can tell you a bit more about who they are and what they do. We have Shiraz Valji of Fortinet. Over to you, Shiraz.
Thank you, Anna. So I'm Shiraz Valji. I'm a consulting system engineer here at Fortinet. These days I'm mainly working with large corporations in building solutions so that they can understand the threat landscape better and better position themselves. That's what I do throughout most of my day.
Thank you. And we have Ian Johnson of Nouveau.
Thank you, Anna. Much appreciated. Morning, everyone. I'm one of the business development managers here at Nouveau, aligned to the IT security technology pillar, working with our customers, both my own customers and colleagues' customers, working with them to understand their security posture and sort of looking at solutions and technologies and managed services that we can integrate into existing solutions to help them on their pathway to a clear security strategy.
Thanks. And Gareth Piggott of Fortinet.
Yeah, thank you. Morning. Gareth Piggott from Fortinet. So I'm responsible for the education and research sector at Fortinet. I've been 13 years in cybersecurity, 8 of those years specifically related to education, building solutions to mitigate against the latest threats with the Fortinet security fabric.
Thanks. Okay, so we all know there has been a spike in web-based malware and phishing attacks since March. But can you explain how exactly did lockdown make life easier for hackers? Let's start with you, Shiraz.
So it's a good question. I think most definitely there has been a spike, but how did it exactly make it easier for hackers? So I think really if we go back to March, April time, the significance of COVID-19 was only really emerging. We weren't really too sure what this thing was, how long it was going to take. And as a result, naturally, there was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt across the world. Everybody was in the same situation. Thought, well, okay, we're seeing the headlines. We're not quite sure which way this is going to go. We really didn't understand how long it will go on for. And so this naturally created the perfect atmosphere for hackers to take advantage of. Hackers didn't really need to do anything creative or brand new here. You can sometimes leverage vulnerabilities that have been in the wild. Some vulnerabilities have been in the wild for many, many years. And you can just play on that human emotion. And I think that's where they were most successful. It was phishing email primarily through, the very first stages, but it was a remarkable click rate. They were clearly getting a good return on their efforts, and it was all about playing into their emotions. For example, we saw the World Health Organization and the UN put out statements on their website saying, we are not sending out mass emails. Stop clicking on these things. They've got nothing to do with us. But like I said, they played on the human emotion. One of the most successful email campaigns was one that was claiming to originate from Italy. Now, as we know, Italy was one of the hardest hit initially. And so there was an Italian email written in the Italian language. And it said, look, please open this because it's got some very important information. And that's all it really took. So I think hackers pivoted really quickly. They saw an opportunity. Did they create something, wild and wonderful and complex? Probably not. It was all to do with human emotion initially.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Shiraz, obviously get that. I don't think there was anything particularly new that hackers were using during this particular period. I think the challenges with the education sector, they're quite open networks anyway. So there's always that challenge of being open, freedom of speech, learning versus locking down against security. Really hard balance to get. So during lockdown, really the priority, and I sympathise with them, was a change in dynamic of the IT estate to remote working, for example, remote access. And the priority during lockdown was just to get the access to the students to continue that learning ASAP. And unfortunately, one of the consequences of that is with them expanding the access just as quick as possible, maybe there wasn't a particular attention to also making it secure. Mm-hmm. So I think in general, like Shiraz says, there wasn't anything particularly new, but there was just more open doors that the hackers could potentially exploit during that period.
I think it also, I was just going to say, I think it also highlights the fact that, going back to Gareth's point, and I completely align to it, is that the fact that education is all about delivering content. And unfortunately, when you're trying to deliver content services, you then have that movement of, individuals now being in the comfort of their home. And that then measures Shiraz's point about being comfortable and susceptible to threats when you're sat at home at your desk compared to being sat in the office or in an educational format. You feel more comfortable, and it's that whole emotional, you're concerned because you now can't leave your house, and it's that whole play on everything that then just puts the mindset into, I can do this and it's not going to affect me type scenario.
Okay, well, let's stick with you, Ian, for the next question, which is, are there new threats that have arisen during the pandemic? And who are the attackers?
Interesting question. And I sort of agree with what Shiraz has said. I don't see any mass new skills or technologies that have come out to really hamper the security practices that are already in place. I think what we're seeing is that it's varieties and the type of content that people are using. The Italian using the World Health Organization as a platform. It's using existing media and mediums to communicate with people, but spinning it slightly that it actually utilizes that emotional interaction with that piece of communication to say, yeah, actually, I am going to click that because I want to find out what's going on. And it's very, very easy. I had a situation only the other day, and it might sound very simple, but I had an email from a bank, and I stopped because I'm working from home. I'm on my personal laptop. I almost clicked it, and I thought, whoa, hold on a minute. I'm a security consultant. Hold on a minute. What am I doing here? And that's when I sort of took a double check, looked at the email, realized the email hadn't come from my bank, and immediately thought, hold on a minute. I was almost caught myself there. So it is that whole, being in your home all the time, feeling comfortable, and you just, get dragged into engaging with these communications very easily.
Gosh, that's really interesting that you were nearly caught out as well. Yeah. That shows how vulnerable we've become as a population. Gareth, what would you say? Would you go along with that? Are there other new threats? Who's attacking us?
Yeah, I think there's always a newer threat coming out. I mean, we're always trying to stay in the IT security industry, always trying to stay one step ahead of the latest threat, and it's a constant leapfrogging type scenario, which is very hard to maintain and keep pace with. I think if you look at the particular attacks that have been in the headlines in terms of the university community, it's been around obviously specific ransomware. where we know that there's been particular data breaches exploiting a particular vulnerability. Information around those particular attacks is not readily available because of the nature and the fact there may be police investigations, etc. Obviously, we know it's out there, and it's seriously affected some of the universities. So not necessarily a new threat, but something that is being exploited more and more. Who are the attackers again? Not quite sure. It could range from sort of hacking groups that are in it just for profit, through to state sponsorship. Anything is possible. The key thing about those is, as well, it's not just withholding data and trying to get some money. There's some crown jewels in that university estate now around research data, for example, a lot of intellectual property that could be sold on. So then you start to talk about it affecting the branding of the university and the reputation. So there could be a whole myriad of people wanting to attack and the reasons why.
Thank you. Shiraz, your views on that, please.
Yeah, I think, look, we're in a fortunate position at Fortinet. We have a team called FortiGuard Labs, and these are the real clever guys that are based all over the globe. And they, over the last 20 years, they've built this neural network with sensors dotted all over the globe that collects literally billions of events that correlate to threats every day. And when the FortiGuard Labs team recently released a publication on their findings on the first half of this year, they found that, yes, the cyber criminals for the first half of the year, or let's say to begin with, when COVID was first emerging and the impact of it was first emerging, these attack groups or these attackers were mainly opportunistic fishers, and some of them later on were absolutely nation-state actors. Like I said earlier, April, May, we saw a high peak in phishing. But then they started to get a little bit more sinister, as Gareth pointed out, that the educational sector specifically, that we saw a surge in some real high-level actors creating threats that were far more sinister than the phishing attempts that were quite opportunistic. We're now seeing, well, hold on, we're seeing cleverly crafted, complex attacks that are going after that intellectual property. You see, if you're a university, whether you have a research function or not, I doubt anybody is double checking on your website. Okay, does this educational institute have a research institute? Yes or no? You're going to fall under that umbrella, and you will be targeted. And we absolutely did see that. So initially, it was information stealers, ransomware, and then it started moving on to more complex nation-state attacks. And the ransomware that we saw again wasn't brand new. These were ransomware variants that were in the wild for quite some time. Albeit there was one variant called Co-Viper that was particularly sinister. That would alter something that we called the master boot record. It just made it incredibly difficult to, restore correctly. And, they were essentially locking out your laptops. Now, that put educational institutes or businesses in really difficult positions, because not only was your data held at ransom, you had a choice. Well, if I restore my data, that's fine. But what could happen with the data that they've now taken? And time and time again, we've seen that they do follow through. They actually, they threaten and say, we're going to put this data on the dark web. We're going to make all this data available. And unfortunately, we're now seeing a trend where they absolutely follow through with that.
Goodness me. So would you say that universities with research facilities who are working on COVID-19 vaccines, for example, and treatments, they would need to be particularly careful? Are they a particular target at the moment?
I mean, look, I don't want to fall into the category of those security professionals that start shouting from their ivory towers, everything's on fire and it's all a mess and you all need to protect yourselves. I don't want to fall into that bucket, but the report that was recently released by our FortiGuard Labs team, the real smart guys, had education pegged as number 3 in terms of threat. It was right up there. And I'm sure that is underpinned by the activity that we've witnessed from nation-state actors that are just going after that intellectual property, that are just going after that research data.
Right. Okay, thanks. So let's go on to talk about the solutions to those threats. Looking on the bright side, there are solutions. Ian, would you like to start this one off?
Yeah, of course. And I think this is quite an interesting point, and one that actually, as we have engagements with people that are joining the session today, I don't think there's a one size fits all, and I also don't think there's any silver bullet. I think it's very much so looking at the security strategies that educational institutes are working towards, understanding where their risks are, understanding if they're consuming cloud services or they're going down the road of an on-prem type strategy, and really engaging with them to then look at what a multi-layered security strategy, looking at mobility, looking at, as Shiraz and Gareth have touched on, intellectual IP, and looking at how we can protect that from on the internal network. It really is. It's looking at a whole, not plethora, but a number of different security technologies, may that be firewalls, and then looking at the different layers as we come into the network. And I think actually with the whole mobility working now, actually one of the key elements of the network, and it's almost gone sort of full circle in the last 20 years, is the endpoint now is becoming a very, very important part of the security strategy. We've sort of moved away. You sort of go back to the days in the sort of, when I first came into security in the early 2000s, where security was very much so focused on the endpoint. And we sort of moved away from that and putting in layered security platforms like email security, web security, firewalling. And now, because everyone's now moved outside of their sort of traditional parameter being inside the office and they're now working from home again, that attack vector is going to be your endpoint device. And therefore making sure you've got the latest endpoint technology that would look at not just signature-based content, but looking at behavior analysis, utilizing some AI to really start figuring out what applications, what services are running on that device. And if it is malicious or there's something going on that's not quite right, that AI, that behavior analysis can really feed back to other systems within that security architecture to help it look at false positives, false negatives, and work with the teams, because there are security teams that have to look through all of this analysis to then work out what is a false positive, and then be able to work through it. Or if there is an event that's then turned into a serious attack vector they need to look into, they've then got multiple parts of their network that they can consolidate that information and then be able to start reacting to it accordingly. Shiraz, do you agree? You're the more the techie between us.
Yeah, I mean, look, I absolutely do agree, Ian. I think you're completely right when you say there is no silver bullet, and there never will be a silver bullet to resolve this, the problems that education and businesses and enterprises are facing. And be wary of anybody that approaches you and says, you know what, if you put this solution in, you're going to solve all the problems, because 9 out of 10 times that is absolutely not the case. And so personally, before I would even spend a penny, I would step back and take stock of what is important. Now, I realize educational institutes, I used to work in an FE college many years ago, and there was no dedicated security team. We were fixing projectors, as well as, figuring out complex networking issues on some Cisco switches, why the spanning tree wasn't working. It's very really, you'd be very lucky to have a dedicated security team. And if you have the dedicated security team, I think the number one priority is to have a look at your estate and evaluate, actually, where is my most critical data? And somehow, some way, assign a value to that data. Okay, well, if I was to lose that, this is how much it would cost to replace. And actually, what are the ramifications and what are the consequences of losing student data? Or what is the consequence of losing a couple of operating systems? Try and understand where you are. And then I think the next step is to talk to trusted partners, because a trusted partner will sit with you and have a look at your estate, have a look at your concerns, and then offer the most appropriate control. Rather than, and I think the security industry is guilty of, sometimes way overcomplicating things, when really what we need to have is a conversation, understand, well, okay, if you've got students that are accessing emails, if you've got staff members that are working from home now, these are the likely entry points of malicious activity and bad payloads, and address those. You can't solve every problem immediately. I think you need to literally take a deep breath, step back, work with a trusted partner, and then address the most common problems. Believe it or not, email security is still the number one vector where all these attacks are mainly coming in from. And I've spoken to many firms over the last 6 months, and they're like, yeah, well, email, we've outsourced that now to Microsoft. All our mailboxes are done in Office 365 or whatever it may be. But how good is a protection that Office 365 or Microsoft are offering? Is there any benchmarking that's been done? And this is where having conversations with trusted security advisors like Nouveau, where you sit down and say, well, look, show me what I could potentially be missing here. Because if the statistics are right, most of these phishing campaigns come in through email, and it should be relatively easy to pick these things up. It doesn't matter how complicated the attacks get. You need to have an email solution that has pedigree. And then, of course, you have sandboxing technology, then you have endpoint protection, and then you have threat intelligence. And suddenly I sound like one of those annoying security guys that start reeling off a big list of technologies. But these technologies need to be able to talk to each other. They need to be able to cover a broad range, and there must be automation. If you're relying on that poor knock or sock engineer to come in the morning and scroll through the alerts and see, oh, that doesn't look right, and then to take action, it's too late. It's far too late. So when you talk to partners or security vendors, try and understand if you're getting something that can actually augment your processes today. You want that broad view, you want that integration, and you must have automation involved there somewhere. Hopefully I didn't go too technical there, but I want to try and keep it above, but yeah.
Gareth, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think just part of, I think the education sector is always under-resourced in terms of people and funding. So maybe taking a step back, the first part of that is thinking about sort of reduction in human error, introducing some training, some awareness around the latest threats. I think any college, school, university should take that upon themselves just to increase that awareness, reduce the risk of someone clicking on a phishing email, spot the key points there with some cyber security training. So I think that should be really phase one, and that relays onto what Shiraz was saying about taking that step back and understanding where the gaps are. Phase two, of course, is trying to introduce some sort of layered security approach. We talked about perimeter, cloud, endpoint already, but if you have got a strategy around that, then that is the way to go. But it's not just about putting point products in. It's trying to introduce a cyber security program that is interoperable with each other. You can consolidate across various platforms. I think that's fairly key, especially where you've got a reduction of staff looking after lots of different things. And as Shiraz says, automation. Again, staff training is about reducing human error. Automation, anything you can get any of these tools to automatically do, again, reduces that sort of human error, which potentially is one of the exploits that will come out of some hacking. So there is some phases. And what we're seeing as well is, and again, going back to Ian and Shiraz's comments, there is no silver bullet. So us as a vendor, we're not under the illusion if you buy everything else, you still won't get hacked. If someone wants to get through, they will get through. So what we're seeing now is perhaps a shift in budgets to more around sort of visibility and remediation. Reduce that time that you're going to burn on looking at, if you've been attacked by ransomware, reduce that burn time with some proper visibility and remediation tools. And then I think, you've got a nice rounded approach to that.
Okay.
Can I just follow up from that on that as well, Anna, just to sort of further highlight Gareth's point, and I completely agree with what Shiraz and Gareth have said. It is that it's having, from a trusted partner as we are, it is looking at that strategy in terms of making sure that the different components, the different layers of that security life cycle and solution set that you'll be working towards can speak to each other, because the more the understanding and what's going on within the environment can cross-pollinate and have visibility of each other is just going to help, systems actually be able to make some key decisions. But secondly, give that visibility to the security teams and the IT teams, so they're not wasting time trying to find something. As Gareth said, it's right there in front of them, and they can then react accordingly to it.
Thank you. And audience, remember that if you have any questions for Ian, Shiraz or Gareth, you can pop them in the chat box and we'll ask them at the end. Can we move on to talk about the misconceptions that stakeholders in a university have when it comes to cybersecurity? Let's start with the senior leadership teams. Shiraz, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to misconceptions, I have a bit of an opinion on this. I'm not sure where everyone else sits, but I think misconceptions are at both ends. You know, security professionals can also have misconceptions. As much as we like to assume other, our customers or potential customers or prospects have got it all wrong, security pros can also be guilty of this. I remember when, during the aftermath of WannaCry, there were so many security professionals coming out of the woodwork. I can't remember where exactly. I think it was Twitter. Excuse me. And they were saying, well, WannaCry should never have happened. There were patches available to Microsoft. Patches were available, 2 months or I think 3 weeks before these attacks took place. I can't remember the exact timeline, but I would say that this is a misconception of security folks who believe that that is enough time for enterprises, educational institutes, and businesses to apply patches. That tells me that individual security professionals have a poor understanding on how businesses and educational institutes and universities are run.
Mm.
And because it's not just the fact that you haven't had time to patch those. These services are in use round the clock, and 3 to 4 weeks, even 3 months in some cases, is not enough time for big organizations to go ahead and patch those services. So that is something I probably wanted to get off my chest when it comes to misconceptions. We love, saying to, Mr. Customer, you guys have got it all wrong. But actually, we also need to take a step back and see things from their perspective. You can't necessarily patch something in 3 months. That's just not enough time in some cases. So going back to answer the question, senior leadership, some of the misconceptions. I think as cliche as it sounds, risk is a big one. Excuse me. I think risk is can be misinterpreted, and I think it's probably one of the most important questions that everybody should be asking, and senior leadership should absolutely be asking. Where is the risk? Is this an acceptable risk? Is the risk tolerable? Can I accept this risk? Because you can never, like Gareth and Ian have both said, you can never eliminate absolutely everything. Even with an infinite budget, there will still be areas of your organization that will be at risk. Now, I believe it's something that senior leaders, and I have seen positive news come out of the education sector. I read a blog post by JISC not too long ago that said, actually, FE and HE educational institutes are taking security way more seriously now than they ever had done. So there is a positive shift in thinking. And I do believe that senior leadership should be focusing on risk. And then worry about the technology and the implementation and the practices later, but understand where your risk is. If your risk is research data, prioritize the effort around there. If your risk is the student data, then ensure the correct controls are applied there. And then work through the technology and work through the processes, the practices, the controls. But at the topmost level, I think an understanding of risk is critical. And this is something that doesn't come naturally. And so, again, I think you should work with partners and vendors to help you understand and to help you categorize risk. Not everybody has a budget to go to McKinsey or Gartner and say, hey, can you do some consultancy for us and help us analyze where our biggest risk assets are? That's, for a large international bank, they can do that. For educational institutes, I don't think you can employ third-party organizations to help you do that. And it's absolutely critical because what you decide at that level will then filter down.
Gareth?
I mean, I think, being on the sort of front line dealing with colleges and universities, I think mine's fairly simple in terms of misconception. I think that cybersecurity, historically more so than now, we're seeing as a bit of a disruptor. As I said, in my first comment, the universities have got a real hard balance to strike between security and open networks. And I think there's a bit of conception around the fact that security may introduce disruption and may limit that sort of open network, free study, over 18 type environment. So I think that's the general misconception. IT in those sectors has gone from being a sort of like necessary operation to, you know, a fairly crucial facilitator to that education establishment carrying on with what the work they need to be doing. So there is a bit more of a positive upturn on it. Cybersecurity is coming up in the priorities, definitely, as Shiraz says, and obviously the recent data breaches have only highlighted that. But just security doesn't need to be buying additional products that you have to pay for and then you manage. I think it just needs to be viewed as something that can help facilitate the learning environment. Students are king, so if there's lack of disruption to what they can get access to around the learning environments, around their virtual learning clouds, etc., that's key, and that sort of reverses back up to having a proper IT security estate where you might not be subject to disruption through being hacked, etc.
Okay, Ian.
Yeah, to mirror both really. It's that whole risk versus productivity. You know, if you're looking at your risks and understanding where those risks are prevalent, and you can then, as Gareth said, make sure that user experience for students is, you know, is managed correctly, and there's the educational layer on top of that to make sure that they're having that knowledge transfer to see, you know, what the threats are, and as part of their, you know, their educational, you know, ongoing training is to make sure that students are aware of what is happening, what's going on, and then making sure that, yeah, that user experience plus with the back end team then looking at the risks, those combined together, that there shouldn't be the impact that potentially some senior people have expected would be the case if they become too de facto in their security approaches.
Mm. And what about misconceptions among other staff in these institutions? Do you want to answer that one as well, Ian?
Yeah, I think it goes back. I don't think students and staff are that dissimilar. It is all about productivity and user experience. You know, staff members need to be able to gain access to, you know, materials, lessons, all that material they need to deliver their lectures or their lessons they're delivering, and therefore it's key to make sure that they also get the training programs available to them. You know, and there is that educational transfer within universities to make sure that, you know, and if anything, if you look at like social engineering, the chances are it's going to be staff members that have got the potential, you know, added access to certain IP that, you know, students may not have access to, and they're through social engineering and other techniques that these people utilize. You know, staff members could be more vulnerable to being the types of people that people are going to go after to try and gain access to those crown jewels. So it's a very careful balance of making sure those three things are looked after. It's the education, looking at the risk, and then making sure that user experience isn't impacted as you know, as limited as possible.
Gareth, you said earlier about the importance of I think it was you, Gareth, it might have been Shiraz, about the importance of training people who are working in cybersecurity in universities. Do you think that training is also required for other staff?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you know, IT touches everybody. So, you know, the more knowledge you can spread across that, everybody, staff, students, senior leadership, you know, they all touch IT security. They will all be getting, you know, a mail-based system, etc. So training across that whole platform, across every group of every group within the university or college is pretty crucial. So I know that us as a vendor, we've released all our training sort of free of charge in light of COVID to try and help increase that knowledge in the sector. So we're trying to do some active, you know, positive things around that. But yeah, I think that's fairly crucial across the whole platform.
Can we talk about students? I mean, I would, the misconceptions that students have, I mean, would it be fair to say students are maybe more susceptible to phishing attacks, or would that be unfair?
I think, you know, just from my point of view, you know, a student, all due respect to students out there, they want fast, fast and quick access to whatever they need to get, as I say, virtual learning platforms or whatever they do. So obviously they may have a number of different devices that they're using. So again, you've got one person, 3-4 devices. They just want to get access. They're not necessarily that concerned about the security or loading some sort of endpoint agent. So there's definitely a gap there that needs to be filled.
Mm.
Mm.
I just follow on from that. I also think if you look at students, completely carrying on from what Gareth was saying there, they just want access. There are students, and I'm not, pointing the finger at anyone, but they're trying to circumvent these systems as well, because that user experience could potentially be hampered. They're going to try and circumvent them to try and gain access to things or do things on a university network that the security team have put in place to protect them. But then at the same time, it's hindering them from being able to do something, but they're then trying to circumvent it. And again, that then comes back to, as Gareth said on a number of occasions, education, making sure these students understand by circumventing these systems and these could be personal devices. They don't even have to be, devices that are owned by the university. These could be personal devices these students own.
Mm.
The universities put these controls in place to protect them. But of course, they're just trying to gain access to Netflix or whatever it might be on, in the dorms, and they're not thinking about what impact that could have on their own personal devices.
Yeah.
And then it's their personal data. It's not just the university's data. It's then, going back to what happened to me 2 weeks ago with the email I got from the bank. That's my personal IP, and with universities being very open to those bring your own device strategies and trying to integrate security platforms with that mobility and flexible working and all that great stuff, that also then has a knock-on effect to students thinking, right, I just want to get to Netflix. Yeah, but actually, what are the university doing for you to actually protect your IP as well, not just the university's IP?
Mm. Probably a lot of them think, oh, I'm on a Mac, and as everybody always tells you about Macs, oh, they're immune to viruses. They couldn't possibly, So Shiraz, let me ping that one over to you then. So some students can actually make things harder. How do you bring students along with you on this cybersecurity protection mission?
I think it's an important area, and maybe we're guilty to overlook the experience somewhat when it comes to students. But the minute you provide a laptop or you allow access back into your network, back into the universities, the business, the enterprise, wherever it may be, the moment you allow access back in to your organization from an endpoint that a student has, be it a laptop, a tablet, whatever it may be, by proxy, you are extending the perimeter of your business all the way to that individual's house. And that is exactly why, going back to my FortiGuard labs research that has come out recently, we've seen an uptick in consumer home-based devices being attacked and exploited, because the attack groups clearly see an entry point into the network, and the weakest door to kick down is the one probably at your house versus your actual educational institute. So if you can get into a student's house or a dorm or wherever it may be, and this goes to teachers and other staff, faculty staff as well, if you could get in through the weakest point of entry, which is going to be your home router maybe, or it could be a misconfigured CCTV camera, or anything that we have these days at home that has an admin login or something of general poor security through no fault of the consumer, that suddenly creates an entry point into your network. Because now, once you've compromised that endpoint that is remote, it could be anywhere. As long as they can access, laterally move onto that endpoint, you can start the reconnaissance process to understand how we can actually get to the crown jewels, because that barrier to entry is relatively low. And so I don't think we can, ignore students. I believe, going back to what Gareth and Ian said, we're seeing that security educational awareness is way more effective now than it has been in the past. I imagine without these modern security programs, people would be clicking on things far more than they actually are. So I do think it's playing a positive role. But I mean, for students, I was a student, I would click on anything and everything to get what I need, and it's just the way it is. When we were at university, we would, protecting your university or your college is probably pretty low on your list of things to worry about. And so if you're going to provide access back into your headquarters, which these days is, we're seeing a lot of SaaS-based remote learning educational tools now, where it's all in the cloud. So it's up to the cloud owners to make sure those applications are safe. But especially for staff, if you're requiring them to remote back or to access some systems at your HQ, you really need to start thinking about those endpoints, thinking about the right technology that should be there, not just throwing everything and seeing what sticks. We're seeing universities and colleges deploy something that we call EDR technology, which is endpoint detection and remediation. These kinds of technologies are like next generation antivirus tools that are able to swoop up bad payloads before they've been executed. So they're like, well, this definitely looks like ransomware, that feels like ransomware, stop. And before it's executed, they'll stop that. And then you can dictate what happens afterwards. You can dictate that machine is either shut down or it's disconnected permanently from the network, or that user account gets disabled. There's a whole host of activities that you can do afterwards. So I think when it comes to students, I would definitely lock down those things as much as possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have like a complex VPN topology where everything is backhauled. It probably means just some intermediary controls on those endpoints, even making sure it's patched and it's got the latest security updates will go a long way in ensuring, some run-of-the-mill ransomware is not able to be executed. If a nation state actor is after that, then you're pretty much blown, because they'll know ways to execute that. And then you absolutely need to think about the right software on the endpoints.
Okay.
So in summary, if it's students, I would do my best to lock it down as much as possible.
Right. Thank you.
And bring them along for the ride. Make sure they're involved in everything.
Yeah.
So that they can actually see what the benefit are to those technologies being, utilised by the university.
Couple more questions from me, and then we have some juicy questions from the audience that I really want to get to before we run out of time. So Ian, could you just quickly give us some examples of universities that you have worked with and outcomes that you've helped them achieve?
Yeah, no, definitely. There's one specific university that we've been in partnership with now as an organisation for over 5 years. And the university in question is very proactive around security. They're looking at their risks, they're understanding their risks, and looking at a magnitude of different technologies that can integrate together to give them that very clear picture of what's going out throughout the entire university within departments. And there's a clear strategy. They are driving it from the top end all the way down to the departments. Because there are people out there within universities that they have their own opinions. They want to be part of that decision-making process. But actually, you need to have within these universities a strategy that you're working towards and making sure that they're all part of that journey. And actually, when you look at the university in question that we've worked with for a number of years, they're definitely doing that. They're looking at their risks, they're understanding where their risks are, and each department has their own slightly different risks. And they're sure it's not, Shiraz said earlier in the call or in the conference, it's not different technologies. It's making sure the technology is being configured and set up, determined upon where you believe your risks may be. And that's where I think, again, it's not always about buying new product. It's about understanding what products you have, taking that step back and making sure that actually the way that it's been configured and set up, if there's integration that can be created between different other layers of your security strategy, definitely, and that's we're seeing that, as Gareth said, cybersecurity, because of the instance we've seen over the last couple of years, universities are taking it much, much, much more seriously. And therefore, we're on that journey with them.
Okay. Now, Shiraz, I'm going to give you the last word before we get to the audience questions. What does all of this whole period, everything that we've learned during the pandemic about cybersecurity, what does all this mean for the future of cybersecurity?
Oh gosh, if 2020 has taught us anything, is to not try and predict the future. That said, I think probably if we were to, technology seems to be the only thing that didn't break during COVID. you know, all the processes that were put in place, you know, it seems to me like it was the only thing that allowed business continuity was the technology that we had in place. Whether it was put in correctly or incorrectly, it has got us so far in this journey. And I generally think for the most of us, it's worked out very well. That said, I think the acceleration of digital transformation is now going to be happening at breakneck speeds, because it's now more important than ever to ensure that we have these systems in place, that we have a remote working solution, that we have the technology to enable us to function given the situation that we've witnessed and we're still in. Okay. So whatever businesses, organizations, educational institutes, whoever they decide to work with, when it comes to cybersecurity, if your components are not working together, if your cybersecurity posture is not actively working together to cover a broad view of different aspects of your network, if it's not integrated and if it's not automated, you really haven't got any protection at all. Because the old days of having siloed products to be able to offer a certain piece of protection doesn't work today. These components have to talk, threat intelligence has to be shared, and it's not as complicated as so many in our industry would like you to believe. Talk to trusted partners, talk to vendors that understand what you need rather than throwing the entire bus at you, and I think you'll have a much better experience.
Great, thank you. Right, some questions here. We've got one from Elizabeth Rust. You said that attacks are becoming more personal and playing with human emotion. Does that mean that hackers are after individuals more than institutions? Do they use people to get to something bigger?
So I can take that. Absolutely, 100% that is correct. People tend to be I don't want to say the weakest element, but it's that human factor. You can't, social engineer a machine, where you can socially engineer a human being, because that's who we are. And, we have emotions and feelings, and we understand, we can sometimes misread things, and they will play on our good nature. And once you can compromise the individual, all it takes is sometimes that one click. And we've seen time and time again, massive international corporates and organizations brought to their knees just because of one incorrect click or the running of one piece of software that has now spread like wildfire within the organization. So the weakest link, I don't want to say the weakest link is a human, but for lack of a better word right now, I'm going to say it. Absolutely, people are the entry point.
Okay, thank you. Good question here from Jan Weyer in Germany. It's quite a long question, but to Tracy, he is saying universities think of themselves as the experts. That's what they are. They've got dedicated teams or even faculties dealing with IT security, but there is a gap in knowledge between security partners and the universities. How do you breach that gap? How do you open up universities' minds to the idea that they do need external expert help? Is this something that you guys ever come across?
Yeah, I do personally in my role. I mean, obviously there's always the natural thing that we try and promote of us presenting what we do in a solutionized way around our sort of Fortinet portfolio. Absolutely, that goes without saying. And obviously if Jan can get us into this particular university, then obviously they can start to understand our approach around security here and now and going into the future. That's the key element. But where we work quite well across the university sector is referenceability. So obviously there's a bit of a blocker here around them not wanting to be educated by a salesperson or another vendor. If we get them speaking to another university, a peer that has done a similar thing, it is very valuable, and I think Jan's customer will probably get the most out of that. And then obviously we can help in the back end build up that story. But I think referenceability is a key in the sector, so I suggest that might be a tactic that he wants to use.
Understood. Thank you. And that's sadly all we've got time for this morning.
I think Jan's got another question.
I don't know if we've got time for that. Have you got time for one more question, guys? Yeah?
All
right.
It's too technical.
Jan asks about creating a state of mind. This goes back to what we were talking about students. How do you create a state of mind among students and human interactors that values cybersecurity just as much as their iPhone or Netflix access?
Tough.
That is tough, really tough.
Very, very tough. I think, there's the generic sort of social things they do around with their iPhone and their Netflix. I think the responsibility really lies at the university's level. And again, it comes back to this training, awareness. It's down to the university to build secure networks, not networks for security, and partitioning students' access. So there's all those IT fundamentals. In terms of obviously changing their state of mind, again, it needs to be that message that's conveyed out to them. If they do get disruption around getting access through their iPhone, or their Netflix is slow, that could be, a reaction to a potential cybersecurity threat that they are opening up. So I think it's that playing on that emotion of, this is not about blocking your student access and your learning environment. This is about your social life could also be disrupted. Perhaps an angle around that.
Yeah.
So maybe university IT teams need to work with internal comms a little bit as well to get that message out.
I think that would really help. I think that would really help. And just as I said, bringing them into that conversation so they understand what the impact on the university is, but also them as individuals as well. And I think the more that we can educate, the younger generation today, the easier it's going to be as we go forward, because they'll be the teachers of tomorrow. And if they're part of that process now, life will just get not easier, because, as we've all said, don't predict the future, because I think we've learned from this year it's almost impossible to do that. But at least, giving them that education so that they are then passing that down through the generations, so that, hopefully our lives will get slightly easier. I say slightly easier.
Excellent, thank you. All of us here at EdQuarter would like to thank our expert panel from Nouveau and Fortinet, Shiraz Balji, Ian Johnson, Gareth Pigott, and thanks very much to you, our audience, for joining us today. To stay up to date with the latest education news and keep tabs on our exciting webinar schedule, you can visit the EdQuarter platforms on edtechnology.co.uk, universitybusiness.co.uk and ie-today.co.uk. Have a great day, stay safe, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.